The night air felt unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that settles just before something fractures. I stood outside my own house, watching the flicker of red and blue lights dance across the pavement like restless ghosts. The sirens hadn't even stopped echoing when the officers stepped out, moving with the certainty of people who believed the call they received was absolute truth. To them, I was just a silhouette in the dark, a figure standing too confidently on a property someone insisted wasn't mine. The neighborhood around me buzzed softly with that familiar humming undertone, the kind that grows whenever people gather behind curtains, peeking through blinds, hungry for someone else's downfall. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But tonight, that humming carried something heavier, like a distant storm rolling closer. It all started with a single phone call. A call made by a woman who believed she owned the entire block's oxygen supply. A woman whose eyes always lingered on me just a second too long, searching for a justification to weaponize the world against me. She had spent months tiptoeing around the edges of her contempt, letting it seep into every complaint, every fabricated accusation, every attempt to remind me that in her mind, I didn't belong. But tonight she escalated. She called 911 with the conviction of someone certain her word would be taken as gospel. Certain that the system would tilt in her direction. Certain that the officers arriving would see me not as a homeowner returning from a long shift, but as an intruder to be removed. The moment they approached, the air thickened with the weight of assumptions. The humming grew louder, more distorted, as if the street itself was holding its breath. Anne Karen, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, watched from her porch with a triumphant stillness, convinced this would be the night she finally erased me from the space she deemed hers. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know the one detail that turned her entire plan into a catastrophic miscalculation. She didn't know that the badge she hoped would be used against me was the same badge I carried inside my jacket, earned, legitimate, and backed by the very laws she tried to twist in her favor. As the officers demanded explanations, as the night pulsed with tension sharpened by her lies, a strange calm spread through me. She had built this moment brick by brick, fueled by the quiet venom of prejudice and entitlement. She believed she had finally cornered me. She believed the darkness would swallow my truth. But she had stepped into the wrong fight. She had weaponized the wrong system. And she had targeted the wrong person. Because tonight, she wasn't going to watch me be taken away. Tonight, she was going to learn the truth in the most devastating way possible, that the person she tried to evict wasn't just the rightful owner of the home she stood in front of. He was the very authority she thought she could manipulate. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. Long before the flashing lights filled my driveway, the neighborhood had already begun shaping itself into a quiet battlefield. The houses stood in perfect rows, identical smiles hiding the tension simmering underneath. Every lawn was trimmed with mechanical precision, every shrub sculpted into compliance, and every resident carried themselves with the stiff posture of people who believed perfection was a requirement, not a preference. Into this carefully curated world, I arrived, quietly, respectfully, and with the simple intention of living a peaceful life after years of service spent walking paths far more dangerous than any suburban street. But peace unsettled some people more than chaos ever could. Karen had watched me from the moment the moving truck pulled into the driveway, her posture rigid with the kind of suspicion that didn't need words to be understood. She observed everything, what time I left for work, when I returned, who visited, how long my light stayed on. Her gaze wasn't curiosity, it was policing. And with every passing day, her scrutiny grew heavier, as if she was waiting for me to confirm the story she'd already written in her mind. I responded with distance, silence, and patience. But entitlement only intensifies when met with restraint. She began filing petty complaints through the HOA, weaponizing rules that hadn't been enforced in years. The color of my mailbox. The angle of my trash bins. A leaf blower she insisted violated neighborhood noise levels. Her mission wasn't order, it was displacement. Yet the deeper she pushed, the more she revealed what she really feared, that I belonged here just as much as anyone else. That her imagined hierarchy had no power over the truth. She chipped away at boundaries she didn't understand, inching closer to a line she didn't know existed. And the night she crossed it would change everything. As the days went on, Karen's fixation hardened into something sharper, something that pulsed beneath every small interaction. The HOA complaints multiplied, spreading like cracks in a foundation, hairline at first, then widening with deliberate intent. She patrolled the street with the self-importance of someone who believed she had inherited the authority of an entire system. Each step she took seemed fueled by an unspoken belief that her presence validated every accusation she crafted. It wasn't just the complaints. It was the way the neighborhood slowly shifted around her narrative. Neighbors who had once smiled politely now watched with cautious eyes, adopting her suspicion without ever questioning its source. They didn't know why they were supposed to distrust me. They simply accepted that they should. Karen's influence seeped through the cul-de-sac like a slow-moving fog, obscuring clarity and feeding assumptions. Her quiet campaign began shaping me into a stranger on my own street. Still, I remained composed, letting her actions reveal more about her than they ever could about me. But prejudice rarely stops where it begins. It needs escalation to survive. And Karen was more than willing to feed it. Soon she began hovering near my driveway whenever I returned home, making a theatrical display of taking photos of imagined violations. She scribbled notes with exaggerated frustration, as if documenting a crime scene that existed only in her mind. Then came the tipping point. One evening, I returned from a late shift, uniform tucked away beneath my jacket, exhaustion clinging heavily to my steps. Karen was waiting, standing rigidly at the edge of my property, framed by the cold glow of a street lamp. Her eyes followed every movement with the intensity of someone convinced she was catching me in the act of wrongdoing. And as I turned my key in the lock, I could sense something shifting in her, something fed by weeks of entitlement and unchecked bias. She needed a spectacle. She needed a moment that justified all the whispers she had planted. And she found it. Within minutes of me stepping inside, she dialed 911 with practiced urgency, weaving a story that painted me as a trespasser, an intruder, a threat. She didn't hesitate. She didn't consider the consequences. She simply acted on the belief that her words carried more weight than my existence. The call was made. The officers were on their way. And Karen, wrapped in the certainty of her own power, believed she had finally won. The moment the patrol car rolled to a stop, the night seemed to compress into a single heavy breath. The officers stepped out with sharpened focus, their posture tense, their hands hovering near their belts as they scanned the scene. The air vibrated with that low, almost electric hum, part anticipation, part danger, part the weight of someone's lie gaining temporary authority. From her porch, Karen watched with the triumphant stillness of someone convinced the world was about to bend in her favor. The officers approached me with an urgency shaped not by truth but by the fear Karen had orchestrated. She had told them I was breaking into a home, lingering on descriptions that played into their worst assumptions. She had shaped the narrative with the precision of someone who had done this before and expected the same predictable result. She believed the moment they saw me, the rest would unfold automatically. But what she didn't expect was the calm with which I met their tension. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting my hands rest visible and open. And then, with the steady clarity of someone reclaiming a truth stolen from him, I produced my badge from inside my jacket, polished, official, and more powerful than any lie she could craft. The officers froze. Confusion rippled across their faces, followed by the dawning realization of what they had walked into. The narrative they were given unraveled in an instant, replaced by the undeniable weight of authority in my hand. And behind them, Karen's confidence shattered. Her posture faltered, her certainty draining as the reality settled in. She had weaponized the system against someone who was part of it. The scene shifted. The power she clung to collapsed. And for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, the truth finally became louder than her voice. When the truth settled over the neighborhood like dust after a storm, it didn't arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived quietly, slow, undeniable, and heavy. The officers who had responded to Karen's call stepped back, their posture softening as the realization sank in that they had been pulled into a personal vendetta dressed as an emergency. The assumptions that had guided their approach dissolved beneath the weight of my badge, and in their eyes I saw both recognition and discomfort. They weren't dealing with a trespasser. They weren't responding to a threat. They had walked into a carefully engineered lie. Karen, however, reacted differently. Shock flickered across her face first, thin, brittle, fragile. But shock quickly twisted into indignation, as if she couldn't comprehend how the world had slipped out of her control so suddenly. For so long, she had relied on the unspoken advantage that came with her words being believed before mine were even considered. She had grown accustomed to crafting narratives that needed no evidence, only confidence. But now, with her accusation collapsing in real time, she stood exposed on her own porch, stripped of the power she had wielded so recklessly. The officers turned toward her, their questions quiet but pointed, laced with the disappointment of people realizing they had been misled into escalating a situation that never should have existed. They recognized what her call represented: an abuse of emergency services, a manipulation of their authority, a weaponizing of prejudice. And as they gathered details, her earlier triumph dissolved into a frantic attempt to rewrite her intentions. But the truth was already too solid, too clear, too visible for her to twist. The reports began. The consequences followed. Karen wasn't escorted away in handcuffs under flashing lights. Real life isn't always cinematic. But accountability found her in a different, more lingering way. False reporting carried penalties. HOA influence could no longer shield her. The reputation she valued more than integrity began to fracture among neighbors who had once quietly supported her. They saw the shift in the officer's tone. They saw the truth they had ignored. And slowly, the narrative she had curated for months unraveled thread by thread. As for me, the aftermath wasn't marked by triumph but reflection. The humiliation she intended for me had ricocheted back onto her, but the deeper impact was quieter and far more sobering. I had spent years serving communities, protecting people who sometimes saw me as a guardian and sometimes as a threat, depending on what they chose to believe first. I knew the delicate balance of belonging and perception. Yet standing on that street, with my badge in one hand and Karen's crumbling certainty in the air, I felt the weight of a truth I had lived with my entire life. Authority doesn't erase prejudice. Accomplishment doesn't neutralize assumptions. A badge doesn't guarantee safety when someone decides your existence is suspicious. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways after that night. People nodded more. Some apologized without using the word sorry, offering a softened tone or a hesitant wave that tried to bridge the distance they had once helped widen. The HOA quieted. The complaints stopped. Karen retreated into a silence that felt less like peace and more like the aftermath of a storm she caused herself. Her porch light stayed off longer. Her footsteps grew softer. Her certainty no longer filled the street. But the lesson echoed far beyond her. Her actions weren't born in isolation. They were shaped by a society that still allows assumptions to outweigh reality, still allows bias to masquerade as vigilance, still allows certain voices to be believed without question. Her call was a symptom of something larger, something that reaches into the most ordinary spaces and reminds us that prejudice rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time, it arrives disguised as concern, as regulation, as neighborhood safety. In the end, I didn't feel victory. What I felt was clarity. A clarity that whispered an uncomfortable truth. Silence doesn't protect you from being targeted, and respectability doesn't shield you from being misjudged. You can follow every rule, serve every community, and still be seen first through someone else's distorted lens. As I stood in my driveway that night, the last patrol car pulling away, I took a deep breath and looked at the house I had fought to simply call home. The lights glowed softly in the windows, steady and warm. And I wondered, not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever been reduced to a suspicion in their own space, how many more stories like this unfold in the quiet corners of neighborhoods every day, unseen, unrecorded, and unacknowledged?